I took a short break between Season three's release, and I was really disappointed to see the return of a bigger emphasis on resurgence in Call of Duty, and seemingly the killing off of the big map experience. Now, yes, Call of Duty resurgence modes like Rebirth Island and like Fortune's Keep very obviously have more players than the big map variants of Warzone. But this is the first time I can think of in a while where the big map experiences has been so incredibly neglected, had such little content, had effectively 2 seasons of being completely ignored, and also has a lot of untapped potential that's not being recognized and not making it a good experience. So today I want to talk about why Call of Duty is killing off the big map experience, and more importantly, all of the things that could make big map better that they're getting wrong today. So why is Call of Duty not focusing on big map? Probably because the mode has a lot of unappealing tendencies to most players, which is very solvable and something we will talk about, but likely down to 2 things. 1, player churn, and 2, player count. Player churn refers to the number of people who play a game of a certain mode of Warzone and then quit it, or turn off the game, or basically delete the game, uninstall it, or don't touch it for a couple of weeks. It is extremely likely that in resurgence modes of Warzone, the player churn is lower, because players who are of a lower skill, new players, or don't really play Warzone a huge amount, have multiple options to respawn. The modes are faster, they're more compact, they're more quick, and because of that, if you lose a game of Resurgence, you just load into the next one. And that tends to keep player retention high, and the number of players who are quitting Warzone low. So naturally, Resurgence would be an emphasis for a company trying to get people to pay more money for their skins and items, and play the game more. Equally, player count is important. Player count has always been higher in Resurgence for the most part, and you can tell based on the amount of content they have produced for it. As of Season 3, Resurgence is going to have 4 total maps in rotation, whilst Big Map is still stuck with 1. In fact, for the entirety of Season 3, only a single piece of content is coming to the Big Map experience, and that is a Gulag event which allows 2 people to leave at the same time. Which is borderline ironic considering that is effectively a resurgence or respawning mechanic that has been shoved again into the big map experience that people haven't asked for. So we know why, for the most part, Call of Duty is focusing so extensively on these resurgence mechanics and on resurgence generally. But the problem I have with all of this is that big map has been incredibly mistreated. The experience is so far away from what it could be, and that is a very frustrating thing. Because the reality is that Call of Duty has always been successful because it had 2 very unique and very different experiences that were playable in the same place. Arguably 3 if you factor in things like plunder and other limited time modes which occasionally come up. So I wanted to talk about all of the things that they're doing wrong in the big map experience that is making it such an unattractive and undesirable thing for most players. And the first one is the resurgence mechanics. The big map experience is not a natural battle royale anymore. There are less players, substantially more respawns, more flares, more redeploy packs, and more Gulag token kits. And whilst I personally agree with some of these mechanics being there within limits, at the moment, Big Map is effectively Resurgence Light. It is not a unique experience, it feels like an offshoot of the Resurgence experience, and it actually just doesn't make the game very enjoyable. I've had multiple games of Warzone now where I feel like I'm fighting an actual TDM respawn mode as opposed to playing a big map Warzone experience, and it also removes the satisfaction of wiping a squad, dealing with a team, or taking somebody out because they are less valuable. There is a very good chance that that player is going to return, and this is very clearly evidential from the number of flares you see from people when they die, and the number of people who have redeploy packs, redeploy flares, and everything in between to keep their squads back in. So having these 2 experiences sort of mind melding between each other and not actually being unique is definitely something that's hurting Big Map. Yes, it does need respawn mechanics, but it doesn't need them to the extent that it currently has them because it takes away the uniqueness and value of the Big Map experience. Secondly is the player count. I mean, I can play Resurgence with 40 to 70 odd players, whatever it so happens to be at this point, and have a pretty action-packed experience. But for Call of Duty BR, the player count is 100. And according to Call of Duty, this is a design choice. This isn't something that is a technical limitation or a cost-cutting limitation, and even Verdansk on Warzone Mobile has a higher player count. So the most attractive feature of the big map experience, which is more players, more action, and generally decent amounts of intensity, has been taken away from the core concept of the game. Yes, admittedly, even with 150 players, you would probably lose 30 to 40 of those players off the rip in the first couple of minutes. But it does create that environment of intensity and the environment of having higher odds against you in order to win a game. Saying that you beat 150 people is far more interesting than beating 70 to 80 people. So both the uniqueness of having a mode which has higher stakes and also one of its biggest properties of a higher player count has been completely vanquished from the game, making it far less appealing and far less interesting. Because if I want a high intensity experience with lots of gunfights, I don't play Big Map anymore, I play Resurgence. Speaking of content and generally speaking how Warzone works, why have we not seen the return of Al Mazrah? We have 4 maps as of Season 3 for Resurgence, but 1 map for Warzone. And even just playing Warzone Mobile for a few minutes made me realize how great it was to have an alternative map that I could play every once in a while that made things feel refreshing. And in almost every other Battle Royale game, there are multiple big maps on rotation, whether that's PUBG, Apex Legends, or pretty much anything in between, that makes the overall experience far less fatiguing. Because right now, playing Urzikstan over and over and over again, with the same playstyles, the same mechanics of people sitting on roofs with 4 snipers and 6 pies, is boring. But playing Al Mazrah, then playing Urzikstan, and maybe in the future playing Verdansk on rotation, sounds incredibly interesting and offers 3 very different and unique experiences that would make people more willing to play and come back. Hell, right now, I would take Al Mazrah right now over anything. Al Mazrah with these movement mechanics and with the current way Warzone works would be so much fun. And Al Mazrah is on a very similar engine, or at least the same engine for the most part, as the current iteration of Warzone. And whilst I'm not a game developer, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of reason as to why this game mode and map isn't available in the current iteration of Warzone, other than womp womp, I guess. I mean, there's not really a huge reason for it. So when you have a mode with less players, its uniqueness and mechanics stripped away from it, nothing in terms of content for 2 seasons except for a nuke contract that, if we're being perfectly honest, doesn't really work properly, and a bunch of resurgence mechanics, you get a very stale big map experience with not a lot going for it, and even the meta for big map right now is quite stale in itself. Now, I like one-shot snipers to an extent, but without a ranked variant of the big map experience, you are constantly being mullered by one-shot snipers in the current version of Warzone, and it's not particularly balanced. I don't want to see snipers removed for regular public games, but there should always be a ranked big map experience. And the fact that ranked has had such a huge emphasis on Resurgence is crazy to me, because nobody has ever asked for that. Except for a handful of very sweaty Resurgence players, nobody has asked for Rebirth or Resurgence ranked to be part of this game. Now, I understand that the ranked experience is very much a niche format and a very 1% to 2% of the player base thing to be talking about. And I understand most of you probably don't really care. But Warzone 2 Ranked was arguably the only good part of that game. It was very well balanced, it was an enjoyable experience, and even with the mechanics being a headache, it was a good SR gaining experience where you had clear consequences to everything you did, every decision you made, every rotation you made. Resurgence Ranked, if Ranked was already a niche thing, Resurgence Ranked must be even more niche. It must be like 0.1% of the player base who actually care about that experience. And it's not Ranked. Ranked is supposed to have actual consequences for gameplay. Resurgence Ranked is just a bunch of 3 stackers Beyblading into each other at high speeds until somebody eventually wins, with very little consequences for positioning, general gameplay mechanics, general teamwork. It's just random, it's nonsense, it's not ranked, and it shouldn't be anything that Call of Duty even remotely considers to be a ranked experience. So we have a big map experience with less player count, less unique properties, forced resurgence mechanics, and no extra content, no maps, a nuke contract that often barely works, and when it does, often has people cheating on it, and very little in the way of new content. No rotations for maps, no decent balancing passes to keep the meta fresh and not stale, and even the balancing, generally speaking, in terms of one-shot snipers and the way SMGs work, are very much catered towards the Resurgence experience and not the big map experience. Now look, I'm not telling Call of Duty to go and kill off the Resurgence experience. I very much acknowledge that it has a great place in the game, is a bit more casual, and generally speaking appeals to a lot of people looking for fun, quick action with friends. But if you're somebody like me who's been an OG since day one, it's boring. Resurgence is TDM with some extra Warzone mechanics that isn't all that interesting, and even though I'm somebody who very easily could have a massively high KD and drop lobbies and get lots of wins in Resurgence, I just don't find it appealing. It's not satisfying. I don't find it satisfying wiping teams without the experience of that high intensity, high player count experience where the odds are against you. And I think at a very basic level, there should be an expectation from everybody in Call of Duty that all of the modes receive good attention. It's never been the case that some modes have been left in the dust, and it's never been the case that certain modes have just had no content. Both Big Map and Resurgence should receive periodic updates and upgrades on a regular basis, and the fact that Season 3 is releasing with none, and Season 2 had very little for Big Map, is a huge red flag to me that absolutely needs to change. Even if Season 3 just had a Big Map ranked experience to give us something to play in the interim, whilst things like POI changes, map changes, upgrades to player counts, or just generally different ways that Big Map could work was worked on, that would have been enough for most people, and it probably would have been enough for most Big Map players, and generally speaking, it would have just given them something worthwhile playing. But instead, if you play Big Map in Warzone, both Season 2 and Season 3 have had absolutely nothing to offer, and you won't receive anything worthwhile in terms of Big Map until Season 4. And that's assuming they even bother with it then. I'm really interested to hear you guys' thoughts and feelings on this. Naturally, I am somebody who has been playing Warzone since the early days of its release and am a big map enjoyer, but I want to know what the general consensus is from you guys who play at home. As always, folks, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.